Yesterday, we had several of you come out and help with the landscaping. I want to say thank you to those who did that. Particularly thank you to the leadership of Rob Hoisington, Becky Campbell, and Becky Johnson for all their work with that. But thank you for everybody who came and helped. And anybody who has helped or anybody who saw it would recognize this, that something like that just doesn't happen by accident. There's planning that has to go into it. There's a lot of conversations, a lot of ideas, a lot of research that is required for something like a landscaping project it wasn't overly massive, but it was a large project that took a lot of coordination, a lot of people, and a lot of, what do we want, what don't we want, and all those types of things. And life is about plans, about preparations, about getting ready for things. And we do that every day. We do that in all of the various aspects of our life. And getting ready, some people are really good about being organized, about having all these things together, while others are more spontaneous. And it's not the matter of which one is better than the other or whatnot, but to recognize that we prepare. And how we prepare is a lot of times shows the results of what we are going to get. And Nehemiah is one of those people in the Bible who prepared. We've been looking at the stories of Ezra and Nehemiah, and so today we'll be moving into the book of Nehemiah. And we'll see how he prepared and God made him ready when the opportunity arose. But we start with Nehemiah in chapter 1, and we recognize he is in Persia. He is in exile still, and it was in late autumn in the month of Kislev in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes' reign. This is Nehemiah writing this, was at the fortress of Susa. Hanani, one of my brothers, came to visit me with some other men who had just arrived from Judah. I asked them about the Jews who had returned there from captivity and about how things were going in Jerusalem. They said to me, "Things are not going well for those who return to Judah. They are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem has been torn down and the gates have been destroyed by fire." Now, at this point, we have had two groups return to Jerusalem from exile. And the first group was about 50,000 people that had been almost 100 years earlier. So Nehemiah is several generations removed from the first people returning to Jerusalem from exile. And we see that 50,000 people, we could be talking several 100,000 people by this point in history. But Nehemiah was pretty comfortable where he was. He was successful. He remained in Persia, and God used him in Persia, and he thrived while he was there. And part of this begs the question as to why would he inquire? Why would he ask for a report for what was happening in Jerusalem? I'm sure he was hoping for positive news, like, hey, things are going well, people are thriving, and all those types of things. But he heard negative news, that things weren't going well. And one of the things is we see that with Nehemiah getting this information comes obligation. When you hear bad news, there's an obligation to respond. There's an obligation to act and do your part, whatever that is. For Nehemiah, it would have been a lot easier not to know. It would have been easier for him to just pretend that everything's going well in Jerusalem, continue to thrive in Persia where he was. But he found out that God's people were struggling. It had been almost 100 years that they had returned to Jerusalem, and they had essentially built the temple. Now, building the temple was a big feat. It was a really big deal. But if several 100,000 people are together and the biggest thing they accomplish is building a building and not restoring themselves as a nation, not restoring the city, we see in context that they didn't get a lot done. I'm not trying to minimize the power of the temple and the spiritual side of that, but to recognize that they were floundering, they were struggling, they were just not doing what they really should have been doing. But Nehemiah had a burden. It was put on his heart that, he needed to do something. He needed to act. But he wasn't ready yet. And again, preparation is important here. And we prepare for all sorts of things in our life. This year, I accepted the volunteer responsibility of T-ball coach. It's been interesting. I've coached at various levels. I've coached high school, I've coached middle school, but it's a lot different context coaching 4, 5, and 6-year-olds. Right? I mean, the understanding of the game is not difficult for me, but trying to communicate to these eager kids with a lot of energy. But whether I'm coaching 4 and 5-year-olds, middle school, high schoolers, one of the things that applies across the board is that as a coach, if I show up without a plan, practice isn't going to go well. So I come up with a plan. Now plans change, don't get me wrong. It's not as though we always have our plans fulfilled exactly as we prepared them. But the reality is, if I show up with a plan, we have a much better success of having a productive practice. Now since we've been here the last 3 years, I've participated in our church slow pitch softball league, and it's a lot of fun. It's fun doing that. And the older I get, the more I recognize the importance of preparing for the games. So when I was younger, I would just kind of show up. Oh, okay, no big deal. But then I got older, and I thought I was getting wiser, and said, you know what? I'm going to start stretching now. Right? But at this point, I'm to the age where my mind still thinks my body works like it did 10 years ago. And so my preparation now, I have to start exercising weeks, months before the game so my body is ready, so my legs work like I think they should work. Because otherwise, it just doesn't happen. See, preparation is part of life. It's part of what we do. And so Nehemiah hears this word, hears this report from what was happening in Jerusalem, and this is his response in Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 4. It says, when I heard this, I sat down and wept. In fact, for days I mourned, fasted, and prayed to the God of heaven. Then I said, O Lord, God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps his covenant of unfailing love with those who love him and obey his commands, listen to my prayer. Look down and see me praying night and day for your people Israel. I confess that we have sinned against you. Yes, even my own family and I have sinned. We have sinned terribly by not obeying the commands, decrees, and regulations that you gave us through your servant Moses. Please remember what you told your servant Moses. If you are unfaithful to me, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and obey my commands and live by them, then even if you are exiled to the ends of the earth, I will bring you back to the place I have chosen for my name to be honored. The people you rescued by your great power and strong hand are your servants. O Lord, please hear my prayers. Listen to the prayers of those of us who delight in honoring you. Please grant me success today by making the king favorable to me. Put it in his heart to be kind for me. In those days I was the king's cupbearer. So his response, he grieved, he mourned, he was broken because of the sin. Remember, Nehemiah stayed in Persia. For almost 100 years, God's people had returned to Jerusalem and had started to rebuild. They built the temple, and after that, they kind of floundered, meandered a little bit, didn't have clear direction. But Nehemiah stayed in Persia. It's real easy for the people who return to Jerusalem to say, well, at least we didn't stay. At least we didn't stay where it was comfortable. At least we didn't do this, that, or the other. But don't get caught up in that, because the point is not whether people returned to Jerusalem or stayed in Persia, because God called his people to thrive. He called them to stay where they were, to serve him in various capacities. And at this point, God is beginning to work in Nehemiah's heart to say, we need you to bring the change that is necessary for God's people. Nehemiah was devoted to God and to God's people. He stayed in Persia, but he was not loyal to Persia. He faithfully served there, don't get me wrong. He was obedient there, but he was first and foremost loyal to God and his people. And we find this in his prayer because he confesses. It's real easy to point fingers. It's real easy to notice how others are doing things they shouldn't be doing. Nehemiah could have been justified, said, "Oh Lord, please forgive these people who just aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing." He implicated himself in the sin, recognizing the corporate nature of sin. This is our problem. When we talk about sin, it's not just your problem. It's our problem. We work together to overcome this sin, whatever that may be. When we're failing to follow Jesus in the way He calls us to follow Him, we work together to pursue Him as a community. It's real easy, real tempting to try to follow Jesus by yourself. Say, I don't need you. I don't need this person or whatever. Because I see that person over there is imperfect. So I'm going to go try to live the perfect life. I can't get help from that person. Nehemiah didn't live that way. He didn't function that way. He sought the community. He included himself in what was happening. But then he calls to God to remember His promise. Not in a way that was arrogant and say, God, you said if we do this, you'll fix it. A way and he was pleading, which he was crying out to God, saying, we can't do this on our own. We need your help. We need your power to come into our lives to fix the situation. God promised to restore His people. One of the great things about God is that when people make a wrong turn, when we stray, when we go off in an incorrect direction, God always provides ways for us to come back to Him. Now, we can continue to make wrong choices. That's not the point. But God says, here's the path back. So Nehemiah is praying for God to reveal the path back to Him, the path to restoration. And he comes to God with complete humility. We talk about entering God's presence and for Jesus to come be with us. You know, there's no room for arrogance in God's presence. We have to be humble. Because if God is the God of the universe, if He's all-powerful and all those attributes that we give Him, then who are we to be arrogant? If we believe in God's power, then we come to Him with complete humility. But humility doesn't mean weak, and Nehemiah shows us what it means to be a strong and courageous leader. We'll see throughout the rest of the story of Nehemiah how God used him and how he courageously confronted obstacles. Courageous leaders do great things, do powerful things, live in obedience to who God is. But courageous leaders don't lead alone. They inspire others to have the same type of courageous faithfulness as well. And we'll see this with Nehemiah. Someone like a courageous leader like Nehemiah not just leads well, but he raises the capacity of others. He helps others see their potential, see the fact that God can use them and that God is moving in their lives. As Nehemiah is praying, he is praying for God to restore. And we don't know exactly what was going through his mind or how he was processing this or the conversations he was having with others. A temptation that we have is to make plans and ask God to bless them after we've made them. God, here's our plan. Here's what's going on. Please bless it. But Nehemiah, first and foremost, said, God, we need you. Then he said, reveal your plans to us. A misconception I think we get with prayer is we kind of function sometimes as though prayer, when I pray to God, I am trying to convince God that my way is the best. It's, hey, God, I've got this list of needs. Can you fix this in this way? Can you fix this in this way? Can you fix that in that way? And do all these things. Which there's nothing wrong with going to God in prayer requests. Saying, God, can you fix this? There's nothing wrong with that. But prayer is not about me convincing God of my way. Prayer is about me getting in line with God's way. It's about me recognizing who God is, for God to reveal Himself to me so that I can better understand what He's calling me to do. It's about God revealing Himself to me. Prayer is not about me. It's not selfish. It's not about going to this genie to help your wishes to be granted. Nehemiah went to God and said, we need you. We have failed. Please come to us and reveal your plan so that we can get back in line with you. That's how he functioned. Now, there's nothing wrong with making plans. But one of the things about plans that we have to recognize is that prayer prepares people for purpose. When we pray, when we spend time with God, it prepares us for whatever is going to come. It's not about, hey, God, this is my way. Can you fix it? It's about, God, come into my life. My life needs you. Please reveal to me what I need to do to join you in your plan of redemption. That is what prayer is called us to do. And then Nehemiah ends chapter 1 with this kind of little tidbit, but it's important for us to recognize. He says, I was the cupbearer for the king. Now, this is an interesting position as far as I'm concerned, because the cupbearer would be someone who would just basically be next to the king 24/7. If the king wanted a drink, the cupbearer would taste the drink and say, it's safe, give it to the king. Make sure there's no poison in the food and drink. And Nehemiah would just be with the king all the time. And there were likely other cupbearers as well, so there's some type of rotational basis on some level. But in order for someone to rise to the level of cupbearer, they had to have certain characteristics. They had to look good. The king didn't want some not good-looking person standing next to him all the time. The person needed to be well-read, needed to be educated, needed to be able to give advice if asked. So the king had a somewhat close relationship with the cupbearer. Now, if you can imagine, if someone was right next to you all the time and their sole purpose was to die so you didn't have to, or potentially die, you would gain some respect for that person. Or you would get annoyed by them and find somebody else to do it. So they had some type of a close relationship. And this is where God is leading, which is where God is preparing Nehemiah. Because we get to chapter 2, and when we find that the opportunity is getting ready to present itself. But Nehemiah prepared in chapter 1. And I think sometimes we like to prepare last minute. And in some levels, I'm guilty of that. But one of the areas I'm not is filing my taxes. Some of you may have filed your taxes this last Monday. Last minute, there's perfectly legal, nothing wrong with that. But every year, throughout the year, I am preparing constantly for the next tax filing season. Because as a member of the clergy, I have certain tax things that I have to organize and receipts and keep track of. And so I have spreadsheets and I have a numbering system of these types of receipts are on this spreadsheet over here, and these types of receipts are on this spreadsheet over here. So when tax day comes, I just hand my accountant a few pieces of paper and say, this is it. Because I've already done all the preparation work. Some of you maybe just throw all your receipts in a few folders and say at the end of the year spend several hours going through that or handing it to somebody else to do that and go through it. And there's nothing wrong with that. What I find, though, is that when we wait till last minute to do something, a lot of times it increases the likelihood of mistakes that will miss potential opportunities. Nehemiah had prepared. He was ready. And in chapter 2, we find that the opportunity presents itself. Because early in the following spring, in the month of Nisan, during the 20th year of King Artaxerxes' reign, I was serving the king his wine. I had never before been sad in his presence. So the king asked me, why are you looking so sad? You don't look sick to me. You must be deeply troubled. Then I was terrified, but I replied, long live the king. How can I not be sad? For the city where my ancestors are buried is in ruins, and the gates have been destroyed by fire. The king asked, well, how can I help you? With a prayer to the God of heaven, I replied, if it pleases the king, and if you are pleased with me, your servant, send me to Judah to rebuild the city where my ancestors are buried. The king, with the queen sitting beside him, asked, how long will you be gone? When will you return? After I told him how long I would be gone, the king agreed to my request. I also said to the king, if it pleases the king, let me have letters addressed to the governors of the province west of the Euphrates River, instructing them to let me travel safely through their territories on my way to Judah. And please give me a letter addressed to Asaph, the manager of the king's fortress, instructing him to give me timber. I will need it to make beams for the gates of the temple fortress, for the city walls, and for a house for myself. And the king granted these requests because the gracious hand of God was on me. When I came to the governors of the province west of the Euphrates, I delivered the king's letters to them. The king, I should add, had sent along army officers and horsemen to protect me. But when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard of my arrival, they were very displeased that someone had come to help the people of Israel. Nehemiah prepared in chapter 1 for the opportunity that God gave him in chapter 2. He was in the presence of the king, of King Artaxerxes, and he was sad. That wasn't allowed. The king did not want sadness in his presence, didn't want frustrations, didn't want discouragement, didn't want anything but good things around him. There were enough people in his kingdom that he could have found somebody else to be happy to fill Nehemiah's spot. In fact, if someone like Nehemiah would be sad in the king's presence, he could be banished or even killed for that offense. That's how intense it was for him to be sad. But for 4 months, it's about 4 months since chapter 1 to chapter 2. For 4 months, Nehemiah had been sad. He'd been processing. He'd been mourning. He'd been grieving. He'd been praying about all of these things. And so Artaxerxes comes and says, "Why are you so sad?" He says, "You're not sick. What's going on here? What's happening?" But because Nehemiah had prepared, because God's gracious hand was upon him, Artaxerxes responded with compassion. He didn't respond with condemnation, didn't exile him, didn't banish him, didn't kill him. He asked a question. And he inquired of what was happening. Now, in this moment, we do find that Nehemiah said a quick prayer. Before he responded to the king, he said a quick prayer. But the reality that we must recognize is that Nehemiah had spent months in prayer prior to this. Because the temptation that we have is we wait to pray until right before it happens. That we have all these quick prayers, these emergency prayers, whatever we want to call them. And there's nothing wrong with those prayers, but we cannot spiritually survive on just those prayers. Those prayers are not what makes us ready for the opportunity. See, if prayer is about me getting in line, told me to do, then it's not something I can just say, "Oh, hey, God, can you help me out right now?" If we haven't spent the time ahead of time, if Nehemiah hadn't spent the previous 4 months getting ready, then that prayer, I think, would have been ineffective. But because he had spent time preparing, he was ready. And he recognized as the cupbearer, he had to wait for the right opportunity. It could have been several months before he was the cupbearer again. And so he had to wait for it, he had to prepare. And when the opportunity came, he couldn't miss it. So the king inquires, the king asks him, and he appeals first and foremost to the king's sympathy. How can I not be sad? The city of my ancestors is in ruins. How can that not bother me? See, he was ready when the king asked him the question, because prayer prepares people for purpose. And this was a moment of purpose that God had given Nehemiah. Amen. So we have this back and forth. The king says, "Well, what do you want me to do? How can I help?" And Nehemiah says, "Here's what you can do." Gives us very specific and exact request so that the king can process it. The king didn't necessarily want to lose Nehemiah. By Nehemiah being in his position as cupbearer, he was valuable to the king, both as an individual, likely as someone to give advice, likely as someone to be somewhat of a friend to. He was valuable, and the king didn't want to lose him. So Nehemiah said, "Hey, here's the plan. My people are in ruins. Let me go fix it. Here's the cost. Here's the time frame. Will you do this?" And the king says, "Yeah." He had prepared. He had planned. He was ready for that moment. We see that Nehemiah was respected by Artaxerxes. Everything Nehemiah requested was granted, but then the king also gave him extra things, gave him a protection detail. You may remember at the end of Ezra, where Ezra was returning from Persia to Jerusalem. He didn't want to take a protection detail because he thought that would show a lack of faith in God. But Nehemiah, being a government official, it was important for him to have this protection detail because otherwise he could be held for ransom and the king could be extorted because of that. So that was something he couldn't necessarily refuse. But Nehemiah was ready for that moment. He was ready because he had spent time preparing, spent time praying, spent time asking God to speak into his life. And as I've said, we prepare in a lot of different ways in life. And every day, you prepare for the day. You have different routines on different days. I'm guessing your routine this morning was likely different than your routine during the week as you go to work or school or whatever you do. But you wake up and maybe you shower, you do personal hygiene stuff, you brush your teeth. You have all these types of things in your morning routine and how you get ready. And there are other things that go into play. Maybe you eat breakfast. Maybe you pick breakfast up on the way. Maybe you don't eat breakfast and you just have coffee. Whatever that is not the point. But you have this routine. You have all these things in place that you do. And so maybe you help take care of the kids. Maybe you help your spouse. Maybe you pick up a friend on your way to work. All these things are part of your morning routine. Is Jesus part of that routine? Because you can talk about preparing for the day. You know, brushing your teeth is a very important thing to do every day, right? It's very important. You wouldn't leave your house without brushing your teeth. In fact, I'm confident you've forgotten to brush your teeth before, and you felt weird about it. Have you forgotten to spend time with Jesus before? And how has that made you feel? If prayer prepares people for purpose, how are you preparing for your day? How are you preparing for what Jesus is going to put in front of you? It's not every day you're going to stand before the King to be able to give a request. But every single day, Jesus gives you opportunities to impact the world with his love and his message. And if we're not preparing for that, I'm confident we're going to miss a lot of opportunities. And this is not about making me look good. It's not about personal glory. It's about Jesus has changed my life. How can I share that with others? Not for me, but for their benefit, so they can experience the same thing that I've experienced. So I want to challenge you, how are you preparing? How are you getting yourself in line with who Jesus is calling you to be? How are you getting yourself ready for the opportunities that Jesus is putting before you? Now, these don't have to be great, grand things. I think it starts with making sure it's a little less of me and a little more Jesus. Because when we prepare with that mind, less of me and more of Jesus, and I think purpose is just going to come like crazy in your life, and you're going to impact people. So I hope that's where you start. Prayer prepares people for purpose, and the more of Jesus in your life, the greater your purpose.